I mentioned about President Obama and Samuel Adams, and I looked a bit more about Samuel Adams, who was one of the early American advocates of independence. But he had an easier job in some ways because he didn't have to win a referendum. He did not need a majority. He did not believe one was necessary. He said, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting bushfires of freedom in the minds of men." Well, I think that's one of the things that we can get on with, but we still have to win a majority. And in any situation where people face the possibility of change, there'll be those who are fearful of it, especially if they're doing pretty well and they're quite comfortable. And we have to persuade such people. We don't have the methods of Samuel Adams available to us. And we have to demonstrate what Mr. Cameron already knows very well, that a Remain vote will not secure a comfortable status quo. That is the true leap into the dark, because a radical new EU treaty is already being prepared. And the outline is in two documents, one called the Five Presidents Report and one called the Spinelli Group Report. Mr. Juncker, the President of the EU Commission, puts the situation like this. He says, our European Union is not in a good state. There is not enough Europe in the Union, and there is not enough Union in the Union. In other words, vast new powers are going to go to the Central. Well, one person who's stood out against this in a rather remarkable way is our next speaker, Stuart Agnew, MEP. Stuart is a Norfolk farmer with long experience of agricultural politics as Norfolk representative on the NFU Council, and he served as county chairman in 1998. He's a graduate of the Royal Agricultural College Cirencester and has been an MEP for the East of England since 2009, and he sits on the Agriculture and Rural Development Committee. He first made a great impression on me when I heard that he had managed to carry a vote in favour of leaving the EU at the Oxford Farming Conference. And I think this was about 3 years ago. That's more or less the high temple of the farming establishment. Now that's really quite remarkable because initially, at any rate, farmers did extraordinarily well out of the EU. And a lot of them are sort of hankering to the glory days of the first 12 years when everything they produced would be bought at a price which was set to keep French peasant farmers from revolting and voting communist. I've been very much impressed by the well thought out view of agricultural policy which he has developed on behalf of UKIP. He's made it clear that remaining in the EU will not be a vote for the status quo because of other developments already in the pipeline, like the likely acceptance of Turkey into the EU, or at least a closer relationship with it, because this will dilute the amount of funds available under the Common Agricultural Policy, as Turkey is a very large country with a poorly developed agriculture and will require massive funding to improve its standards, which means less for existing members. Similarly, the negotiation of an EU free trade agreement with the South American trade bloc Mercosur will open the EU markets to massive imports from Brazil and other countries. Like me, he can remember the system we had before the access to the EU, but has realized the limitation which World Trade Organization rules place on the ability of member states to subsidize agricultural production, and he's tailored UKIP's policy accordingly. He's commissioned an interesting set of high-quality research papers on topics ranging from the EU's impact on dairy farming, which has been pretty disastrous, use of antibiotics in farming, feeding an overcrowded Britain, and the history of the Milk Marketing Board, an institution which was destroyed by our EU membership. And he's prepared an excellent agri-Brexit presentation of a confident future for farming in an independent Britain, which deserves wider circulation. Though as a down-to-earth practical man of wide experience, he's a lively spokesman for our country's independence, and we look forward to hearing from him.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. There's some old faces here from when I joined UKIP in the 90s, and thank goodness you are still here and fighting, because now it's just a few weeks to go, and I've certainly changed as a person over the last 15 years since I've been involved in this, because I never ever thought I would be standing up talking at these events. And somebody earlier on talked about hitting the wrong button in the Parliament. I tell you, it's really easy to do. You might say, well, it's a red button, all you have to do is vote against, anyone can do that. But then you find yourself voting against an amendment to reject the text. And then there might be another one to delete the amendment, that's to reject the amendment. It gets very complicated, I can promise you, and we do make mistakes. Fortunately, we are allowed to correct them within about 3 or 4 working days, which is very helpful. Now, agriculture has really come into the forefront of this debate, because ever since 1972, the European Union, whatever it was called then, has run my industry really from top to toe. There's nothing that can happen in farming in Britain without the EU having a big opinion on it and saying yes or no. And so there are going to be some big changes. And I would say that you've got five points we're going to talk about here. There's the financial support, culture, regulation, trade and labour. I'm not quite sure whether they will come up in that order, but without a doubt, financial support is the one that most farmers are talking about, because they have been used to it. Now, I would not have stood here in 1984, that's after 12 years of the CAP, and said it was bad. I mean, those first 12 years, farmers never had it so good. Yes, of course, they found things to grumble about, because they always do. But actually, if you'd farmed through those 12 years, what did you see? You saw guaranteed prices rising for most of the major commodities each year, and you also saw technology bringing in higher yields. So really, it was pretty good going. 1984, a couple of things happened, and that was they brought in milk quotas. We knew that would happen, but it was the way they did it which seemed so extraordinary. Suddenly, a great section of farmers found they did not have a market for their milk. It was really, really traumatic for them. A little later on that year, we had an absolutely record harvest that bent and spoilt the intervention system. And since then, yes, there have been ups and downs, but you can say 2 dynamics have prevailed. The first is the money available to farmers has reduced in real terms, and the second thing you can say, that money has become more complicated and difficult to access. Now, we've seen the whole thing change. It changed from an intervention system because of WTO pressure. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, said that an intervention system distorted market prices. They didn't like it, but they didn't mind farmers being given a check each year to go and get on with it. And in those days, the check did relate to what you were growing. That again changed here because the World Trade Organization didn't really like the fact that commodities were still involved, and so the cropping was not relevant to the payment. And then we had this 2014 reform, where Commissioner Chillis said, this is going to be a simplification, he said. He used those words. Now, anyone who lived through all of that will tell you there was nothing to simplify what we'd had before. It got horrendously complicated. So we had to get bogged down in a 3-crop rule, greening, so much permanent pasture. The freedom to farm the way you wanted to was lost if you wanted to keep chasing the subsidy. You were just dragged along by the nose like a bull in a ring. You couldn't really do what you wanted to do. They kept saying, this is the direction you must go down. And for many people, it was not the way they wanted to farm. You would farm, you would know which system suited your farm, the most profitable one, but in order to get this payment, you were going down other routes, and there were all sorts of unintended consequences of more tractors going on the road as a result of this between jobs, inefficient use of storage, all sorts of the problems with the packets of chemicals that get left over, all that sort of thing. It just made efficiency a lot less efficient. There were various other things that came into it as well. A young farmer scheme that was just lip service. It won't help anybody, young person in agriculture at all. Definition of an active farmer, this is always a problem, and they brought in the concept, and a lot of the larger arable farmers in the eastern side of the country think, oh well, if the British government does it, they're not going to like the large arable farmers and they're going to cut it all. Actually, the concept of capping the thing came in here at this reform. Very gently, but they brought this in. And I like to warn large-scale arable farmers that once you've got the chip there in to knock in the thin edge of the wedge, they will knock that in. No two ways around it. So what is going to happen? If you're in farming and you've got this vote on June the 23rd, many people will make the mistake that they're voting for the status quo. And we've already heard earlier today that a vote on the 23rd of June isn't a vote for the status quo, it's a vote to confirm you're happy with the project to continue. And so it will be in agriculture. Now, it's going to be quite difficult to maintain the payments to farmers because of the dynamics that are actually working on this. They're all negative. So farmers receive money from a budget, the EU budget. The EU budget is made up of money that all the member states put into it. But their contributions are based on their gross domestic product or their GNI. I'm not quite sure the technicalities of it. And the problem is, so many of those in the Eurozone are doing so badly, they're actually obliged to put less in. They won't put so much in. So that cake is crumbling. Added to that, the larger countries don't like having to keep putting more into the main budget when they're having to make austere cuts at home. And so Cameron came back a few months ago telling everyone how clever he was, he'd reduced our contributions. The cake is likely to get smaller. But what about the agricultural share of that cake? Now, back in those halcyon days of the 1970s, that share was over 80%. It is now down to under 40%. You can't deny the logic of that graph. And it's going to get less because Chillis played the joker. He was only able to keep it at 39% in the last reform by greening, this word greening. They've played that card now. The College of Commissioners want this money for other things. They're like cabinet ministers all grabbing for a bigger share of the budget. They want it. It's as simple as that. And we've got another factor coming into this. How are we going to pay for this huge influx of migrants into Europe from the Middle East? How are we going to pay for it? They have got to be resettled, and I can well see a lot of this agricultural support that goes into what they call Pillar 2, General Rural Development, will be used for the rural resettlement of migrants or something like that. They're going to have to do something. They can't have these people simply living in hostels and dossing on the pavement, etc., etc. They're going to have to be resettled somewhere, and this might be a way of doing it. I can't guarantee that, but when I said that in front of the new commissioner in Wales on Tuesday night, he didn't demur. I thought he was going to say rubbish, but he didn't demur. I thought that was really quite telling. And of course, this support is paid to farmers. It's in euros per hectare, but it's paid in euros. Now, long term, what is going to happen to the euro? It's where it derives its strength as a currency from the German economy, but it derives its weakness as a currency from all the other economies in Europe, with the exception possibly of the Netherlands. Every country that joins the euro has a weaker economy than Germany's. Therefore, you're likely to see the euro getting weaker, which is actually bad luck for farmers. Farmers like a strong euro and a weak pound. You may say, well, that's disloyal, let's wave the Union Jack. It is also true. The stronger the pound, the smaller the subsidy. The stronger the pound, the harder it is to export pig meat, etc., into the European Union. So it's quite likely the euro will get weaker. I know there's fluctuations at the moment over uncertainty, but the factors strengthening the euro are less, in my opinion, than the factors weakening it. So we will be at a permanent disadvantage by remaining in like that with our subsidy scheme. There's another factor at play here, and that is new countries joining. Now, the chairman did mention this. We, in Britain, are one of the few net contributors. So if you look at it purely in agricultural terms, we put, our taxpayers, you, put £6 billion a year into the CAP, and our farmers receive £3 billion a year back from it. So there's £3 billion gets spent amongst other farmers in other parts of Europe who haven't contributed a penny to it. Now, every time a new country joins the European Union, as opposed to countries joining the euro, every time a new country comes in, all the ones in the waiting list are poor. They will put less into that CAP than they will get out of it. There are 5 of them on the list, and as the chairman mentioned, Turkey. Go home, open an atlas on a page that shows Europe and Turkey on the same page, and look at the size of that place. They will expect area-based payments across that massive landmass, most of which is in Asia, of course, and that is really going to dilute the pond. Farmers in this country, if we remain in the European Union, are going to see a lot less support because of all these factors. And of course, there are many crofters in Scotland or farmers in Cornwall who think they're poor, think they're deserving of special EU funds for very poor regions. Forget it. Bulgaria's the new poor. That's where that money is going to go. Now, I've talked about it's getting more difficult to get the money, and indeed it is. For those, and I can see a gentleman over at the back there who is a Norfolk farmer or was a Norfolk farmer, and he will know that filling in this form has got more complicated over the years, and they're asking for a bit more now. We have got environmental schemes in this country which are funded by you, but via the European Union. And we get ourselves involved in these schemes, and we do whatever we have to do, and we receive some money. From now on, if you get involved in these schemes, you're going to have to erect an EU gratitude plaque. And depending on how much money you've received from the scheme, depends on the numbers of gratitude plaques you've got to put in your fields and the size of them. Now, they aren't as big as that. They're not as big as that. But my researcher just couldn't resist putting that in. He said, I couldn't find a smaller one to make the ground. But the point about this is, these environmental schemes are there for us as farmers to make the countryside look better. And what's the point when we go to that effort and we have to litter the countryside up with junk like that? But that is what's going to have to happen. And it's an extraordinary coincidence, isn't it, that it might just start happening in a referendum campaign. That's just coincidence, of course. So what would happen if we left? Would a UK government continue support? Now, since I made this, I've had a good fillip, really, because we've had 2 people saying things. The first person was George Eustice, who's a DEFRA minister, and he is on the out campaign now. He held a press conference here in London about a month ago, and he said that the present government, if we came out, would continue to support agriculture. He outlined roughly how he thought it would be done. It would be a much simplified version of the single farm payment scheme. Actually, not far from my UKIP policy, although I wouldn't like to say anything about that. He also mentioned crop price insurance schemes, which are a good idea because of all the volatility. So he said that was very, very helpful, because he's in a position to do something about it. UKIP aren't in government, the Conservatives are. If there is an out vote, on June the 24th, they are going to have to produce a policy. And so he has started to do that. But the more interesting utterance was possibly from David Cameron, the Prime Minister, who, as we know, is a Remainer. He was speaking to the CLA, the Country Landowners Association, and he did assure them that even if we did leave the European Union, support to agriculture would continue. Now, before I get into that, some of you may be thinking, well, why should they be supported? Should they be supported, etc.? If you look at the moment at the average set of farm accounts across most farms in the country, and from that profit figure, you subtract the subsidy they get, they will, most of them, be making a loss. I certainly would be on my arable side, without a shadow of a doubt, be making a big loss. Now, you could say, oh, well, serve them right. So save the money to the farmers, but those farmers would normally be paying tax. They would stop paying tax if they made a loss. Furthermore, they would reclaim tax from previous years as a refund. So the government would have to shell out They were employing people. They would have to lay those people off who were paying tax and were paying NIC, will now claim benefits. Again, those farming businesses would have been served by smaller ancillary industries supplying this, supplying that, supplying the other. The farmers have stopped farming, they're not buying, so those industries will wind down. And you'll get a rural spiral decline, which is not good at all for anybody. And the next thing it means that if these farmers are going to stop farming, we're going to have to import an awful lot more food. Now, we're an island of 70 million people. We already import about half our food. Most of you will have seen what happened when some terrorists were able to get hold of some aeroplanes and fly into those high-rise buildings. You've seen them walk into concert halls and machine gun audiences. You've seen them do all sorts of things. I heard the bomb go off only 400 yards from me in Brussels. If we start to import 75 or 80% of our food, as an island with only about 5 or 6 deep water ports, we're at real threat from terrorists. They've only got to sink one boat and threaten to do it again, and the rest will stop coming. In our just-in-time mentality, we will get into serious problems. We have to have a thriving agricultural industry in this country that can be expanded quickly if it has to be. We have to do that. A government has got 2 duties: to defend its people and to make sure they've got enough to eat. And once you've missed 4 consecutive meals, you will only be thinking about one thing. Once you've missed 5, you will become a different person. So the psychiatrists tell me. Okay. So that's what we've got from pulling the rug. A lot of people say, well, the Conservatives, they might support agriculture, but not Labour. And I'm glad that Kate's here, because it was the Labour government, immediately post-war, who brought in the whole concept of agricultural support. It was the Labour government who brought in the concept of heritable tenancies, so tenants weren't just thrown out, they could pass the thing on. And it was a Labour government who didn't take the easy option in 2001 of the foot and mouth outbreak. The easy option would have been to say, well, just go and vaccinate. It doesn't matter if you can't export. It'll be a lot simpler to vaccinate. Instead, the Labour government chose the hard route, which was trying to stamp out this virus, which we did against all the odds, actually. It couldn't have been a worse case scenario to try and tackle, but we got rid of the virus. We made our country healthy again from foot and mouth, and the Labour government were prepared to back British farmers in doing that. So I'm glad I can say that in front of you, Kate. I really am. It's not true that it's just the Conservatives that support farmers. It really isn't. Okay, now, many other countries, this isn't just the European Union that supports agriculture. Other countries do. And this list is not exhaustive. And there's something very interesting about this list. There's the EU, the 28 countries, but look at that figure beside it. That figure is the percentage of the GDP that goes to agricultural support. The EU is 0.68%, which is somewhere in the mid-range. Look over here at China, over 3% in an intervention system to support agriculture. This supporting agriculture isn't just the preserve of the European Union. Many people think it is, but it isn't. They're all at it, as a comedian would say. So there you are, and there's many others there as well. And of course, we did support it, as the chairman said, just before we joined what was then it was called the CIB. And this is a complicated thing about how the US supports agriculture. I won't go into that. Now, regulations. And this is an interesting thing. Already, regulations in British abattoirs have been made difficult by EU membership. It all started off with a translation error. We used to have experienced meat inspectors in our abattoirs who did a good job, real craftsmen. But the translation of the directive talked about veterinarians, which they understood as meat inspectors. We took that as trained veterinary surgeons. In other words, you do 7 years training as a vet just to stand in an abattoir gaping at bits of meat. However, that meant that our vets weren't motivated, they didn't want to do that, so we brought in vets from other countries. Dare I mention which ones? No, I dare not. I won't say which. But on the, all right, Spain. This idea of equivalence of qualifications, they're not as well trained, and they can behave like mini Hitlers in these abattoirs, and it's just made things difficult. But it isn't going to stop there. They're going to bring in some more regulations. And this is the headline of the presentation we were given, and I thought it was rather interesting. This was the first slide of a presentation about abattoirs. Now, normally you'd expect in an abattoir to see a cow, a bovine, a sheep, an ovine, a pig, a porcine, and some sheep. What do they put up there? A bovine, a dog, a cat, and a horse. That's a strange thing, isn't it, to put up when you're talking about abattoirs? But that's the world we live in. A little bit mischievous maybe, but somebody's made a mistake, but really pretty silly. Now, what's going on here? You're subsidizing this, did you know that? Well, you are, and I'll tell you how you're doing it, because that 6 billion you put into the CAP, which you think is supporting British farmers, I've already told you only 3 billion does. The other 3 billion goes to support farmers who rear bulls to end up like that. And these things aren't fit to eat. They aren't. They won't go into the food chain. This is nothing to do with farming. It's all about appeasing a Spanish mob. That's what that's all about. And unless we leave the European Union, you will continue to subsidize it. It is as simple as that. So, more regulation. Now, there's all sorts of regulations, and we can't just say we're going to make a bonfire. I know some of the exit campaigners like to say we're going to destroy all the EU regulation. We can't be a lawless state. But there is a number of regulations that I would say an independent British government never would have got involved in. I defy any independent British government to hand over control of food labelling to a group of bureaucrats in a foreign country. We never would have done it. And we have a Secretary of State of the Environment and Agriculture called Elizabeth Truss. And she has to go scampering over to Brussels to ask the Commission their permission to put a different label on a milk bottle. And they will say, 9 or no. That means no. And she has to come scampering back again, a cabinet minister. And of course it's creating problems for our farmers. They want to be able to label food clearly enough so British milk really is British milk and isn't Irish milk in disguise, and so that tin of spam or whatever it may be, it may say it's British because somebody packed it in Britain, but actually it was produced somewhere else. We need to get control of labelling back again, and that is something I don't think we ever would have parted with. Now, this is really very serious for arable farmers. We, as a country, have been ahead of the game on agricultural technology. We have produced pesticides, which are herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, and we have had a system of testing them that's based on risk. In other words, we know this is a tricky material, but if we use it in the right way, we consider the benefits of using it outweigh the risk of using it. And I would suggest something that we all use called petrol. Look how dangerous that is if used in the wrong way. But we consider if we treat petrol in the right way, the risk of using it isn't very high and we benefit from petrol. Now the EU are changing all of this to a hazard-based system. They allocate points of hazardosity, for want of a better word, to all these materials. And once those points exceed a threshold, irrespective of how safely you can use these things, they just say it's out, verboten, forbidden. And the National Farmers Union tell me that we are going to lose about 30 materials, which we heavily depend upon to grow our crops. What really rubs salt into the wound is that American farmers will continue to use these materials and they will export the crops which have benefited from these back to us. I don't think we ever would have changed the system because it has worked pretty well. Yes, there were some nasty ones, Temic, Metacystox. It's the insecticides that are the tricky ones, but we got them out. We've done, and I would back what our country have done, we've done a pretty good job on assessing our pesticides for safety, and we have matched the rising population of our country, etc. We've kept ahead of the game, we've kept producing more food because of these products. Yes, you can say it's ghastly, it's disgusting, and it should all be organic farming. Fine, if you're prepared to pay the price for that, that's great. But if you want to feed this country, then you do need bigger yields. Simple as that. And in my lifetime, I have seen yields go up from 1.5 tonnes an acre to 5 tonnes an acre, purely on the back of efforts of plant breeders and plant protection scientists. They have done it. All we have done is bought into their knowledge, etc. And that has kept the world with plenty of food. So we're going to lose a lot of those, and I don't think we ever would have done it. Now, I am mainly a free-range egg producer, although I do have some arable and some sheep, and I like to buy my poultry feed forward. I like to be able to ring up the food merchant and say, well, can we buy it? I like to keep about 6 months ahead. And because there is a futures market in grain, the merchants can do this. Now, the futures market in grain has stood the test of time. It needs three elements in equal proportions. It needs people who produce the material, it needs people who use the material, and it needs people who are prepared to speculate on setting prices. If you have those three in the correct proportions, you have got a good, solid futures market that people will trade and use. You don't have to if you don't want to. What are the EU going to do with this MiFID legislation here? They're going to make it far more difficult for farmers to personally engage in futures trading. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can use the merchants through forward selling. They're going to make all that more difficult. And the futures market is such a useful tool to us in helping combat volatility, because the world's wheat price depends on the world's weather over the wheat growing areas, and it can vary enormously. Being able to trade ahead by up to 18 months does help to even things out. It's very useful. The EU want to make it more difficult. And we can revisit some of these waste and environmental legislation, which is way over the top and it's just making things very, very expensive. Now, the elephant in the room. As farmers, we're told we must play our part in improving the world's weather. All right? Okay. Now, 30 years ago, almost to the day, I went to the University of East Anglia, where they were saying, we've got a huge problem on our hands, we're getting warmer, it's all to do with more CO2 in the atmosphere, and in 30 years' time, now, you will experience a minimum of 1 metre sea level rise. Put that in the bank, that is going to happen. Whatever we do to try and stop it, it's too late to stop that metre. So the coastline of my country will start to change, and particularly the poor old fens. But that's just put that in the bank. Actually, it's probably going to be a rise in 2016 of not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5. And I thought to myself, well, there I live there. I'm all right, I'm still here. Pity about those poor old chaps there, and is Stradsit blue there? And, you know, all the experts were there at this conference. It was all in the very sincere tones, Professor Hook, Dr. Line, and Mr. Sinker, and everybody else. They had me. I changed my farming system to get ahead of the game, and I bitterly regret it because I lost a hatful of money. I went through the coldest winter I've ever known 3 or 4 years ago. I lost a third of my sugar beet, frozen solid into the ground due to global warming, and it was all going to happen, okay? But it didn't stop there. They said it'll probably be 5 metres, probably. But it could possibly be 9. Well, I think, well, I'm still here. And the scaremongering stops here, I stress. They didn't say any more than that, but it might have got to 9 by today. Today! Anyway, just for the hell of it, I thought I'd go through to see what happens and what it looks like as we go through these different meters, and it gets more and more. And there we are, and I'm still here. Bad luck. Okay. Now, this hasn't stopped, okay? Although the sea levels, if they've moved a millimetre, that's all they've done in the 30 years, the sentiment behind all this is still there. Okay, it hasn't gone away. In the European Parliament, so many speeches, must tackle climate change, must tackle climate. The chickens are coming home to roost on this now because they're saying to everybody, you must reduce CO2. That's one of the little greenhouse gases that makes this planet habitable and makes it possible to grow crops. But apparently it's evil and wicked and cruel, and so we've got to reduce the amount that we have. We've only got 400 parts per million. Plants suffer when it drops down to 270, but there we are. We've got to reduce it. So how are we going to do it? Well, one way, there's a tractor. Now, there should be an exhaust pipe coming up there, but it isn't. It's been diverted over the mudguard of that tractor, and the exhaust is being pumped down behind the cultivator tines and buried into the ground. How wonderful, we've sequestered carbon. That's what they say. The trouble is, you pump a warm gas down into a cold soil, what happens? It goes, bloop, 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 and it comes out again. And it would come out again anyway because the soil has a natural structure of 33% air, 33% water, 33% soil particles. So it's a complete waste of time, but it's more than a complete waste of time because the energy and the fuel needed to pump it down there in the first place will increase the tractor's fuel consumption by about 30%. What a waste of time. But nevertheless, we've we've got to do something about this, and it's all going to be benchmarked. How much CO2 did you emit last year? Not very much, you know, and come into cross-compliance. Your subsidy is dependent upon you making a year-on-year reduction. I mean, you understand how these things work, I hope. You have to tick the boxes. But it doesn't stop at CO2. We got these terrible things, ghastly things that emit methane. Awful, aren't they? I mean, they must be the construct of some frightful multinational company out to grasp profits from everybody and make life really difficult. Actually, these are God's own creatures in a wilder form that roam the great plains of Asia, of America, of Africa, all emitting methane from both ends, and the world survived. Nevertheless, you have got to make her and him emit less methane. And I said to the Commissioner, well, how on earth are you going to go about this? And he said, well, we'll have breeding programs. So I say to the farmers, go back to your herds and your flocks, isolate and select those females that emit the least methane and breed exclusively from them. And you will find that those that emit the least methane are doing so because they're metabolizing a lot slower than the others. So they will produce less milk for a given amount of food, they will grow more slowly. So you are selecting from your very worst animals. So have fun with all of that. I know I'm making it light-hearted, but the 3 R's, the ruthlessness, the remorselessness, and the relentlessness of the European Union telling farmers what to do, it never lets up. And they will get stuck into this the way civil servants love to do. Trade is the next thing. Well, there is a deal to be done here. There really is. Those figures, I think, that one's, you've got, I'm slowly beginning to get my head around all of this. We have a big trade deficit with the European Union as a country, but we do have a surplus on services. If you net those off, I'm told it's 62 billion deficit of trade and services. Agriculture follows the same pattern. Now, since I put these up, actually, it's bigger than that. I'm now told that we import £34 billion worth of fruit and vegetables and food, £34 billion worth of food and drink from the European Union, and we export 16 to them. It's a hell of a big difference there. They desperately need our market. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We export £170 million worth of lamb to France. Now, we want to keep that market. And the Welsh farmers are very dependent upon it. We need that £170 million. But the French grape grower causes £650 million worth of wine to be exported from France to Britain. Now, who's going to rock that boat? Why get involved in a fight about that? Bring in tariffs, who's going to lose? It doesn't stop there. We export £40 million worth of beef to Spain. We import £550 million worth of fruit from Spain, a massive gap there. The Spanish and the French economies are in trouble. They're not going to walk away from such substantial customers who pay on time. They're just not going to. Now, China has no agreement with the European Union, no proper formal agreement at all, not the single market, no preferential arrangement. It manages to sell £300 billion worth of goods into that single market. The United States is about 200. These are enormous sums of money that they're able to receive from the European Union without paying any contributions in, without having any freedom of movement. There are a number of models, and the NFU, I think, have been wrong to just keep talking about the Norwegian model as the only one. The Norwegian model is one of 5, and you'll hear more about that. It suits the majority of Norwegians. That's what Norway want. The Swiss have a model. And there are 3 other models shared between 60 other countries around the world. We, because of the extraordinary unique position we are in, of being their largest single customer, right on their doorstep, and being the 5th largest economy in the world, we can produce our own bespoke trading arrangement, and they will want to get on with it. And if we wanted to, in the meantime, we could sit as a default in the EFTA while this is all being negotiated, and we would have that sort of protection. This can be done. It's not impossible at all. Now, the chairman mentioned TTIP and Mercosur. Mercosur is gone onto the back burner now. They've at last seen sense about what happened to the beef industry, and that is It'll come back again, it always does, but for the time being, but not TTIP. Well, at the moment, TTIP's still going ahead. Has implications for agriculture as well as the National Health Service. And this is a typical problem now, egg production. I'm an egg producer, free-range egg producer. Now, the European Union produces eggs. In Britain, the majority are free-range eggs. In other countries, the other 27, particularly say it's 25 of the others, they don't have any free-range industry at all. So when the EU Trading Commissioner is talking about eggs, they're thinking about sort of colony production. That's what they're thinking of. They're not thinking about the British egg producer who is likely to be a free-range producer. So they're in negotiations with the United States, and we've got an interesting conundrum. It's the definition of the appearance of a free-range egg. Here, my free-range eggs must have a brown shell to be classed as free-range, and they must not be washed. In the United States, they must have a white shell, and they must be washed. Now, who is going to decide on that trading definition? And if the Americans get their way with their much bigger industry and their bigger clout, all the work we've put into building up this brand, the consumers knowing that brown shell means free range, will be just washed down the plug hole, as they say. I don't know what's actually going to happen, but it's because the EU will be thinking along different lines to what's actually happening in this country. I've done those there, got them from memory now. Labour, yes, a lot of the horticulturists and the poultry processing industry have a point saying at the moment they're able to get as much labour as they want with no questions being asked. However, we do live in dangerous times. We have got to control our borders. And we accept that between 30 and 40,000 people are needed to pick the fruit harvest in this country each year. Many people think that if we leave the European Union, all of those who have arrived legally under free movement rules will have to go. They won't. There is no question of send them back. Most of you will know this under the Vienna Convention, but a lot of people think they're all going to have to go. They're not. They will stay here, and many of them are vital now, getting better jobs on farms, head tractor drivers, etc. They will stay. All we need to do is have a work permit system that would actually work very similar to the old SA, the SAWS, Seasonal Agricultural Worker Scheme, but you would require the employers to get work permits. They would be responsible for the recruitment, for the housing, for the health insurance, for the conduct, and for the timely return of those workers, and if they didn't do it, they wouldn't get a permit next time. It's not that difficult. There are 480 million people in the European Union to choose from. I'm sure we can get 40,000 here each year under a work permit system. I think that's it, and what I'd like to finish up with is talking about this European Union. Try and see it as a marriage where the husband is the UK and the wife are the rest. And the two stand on the bridge at Maastricht and they hold each other's hands, staring to one another's eyes for ever closer union. However, as years progress, there are a couple of little infidelities on behalf of the husband. There's Miss Euro and Miss Schengen. And the couple look at one another and they realize that actually this is over. One of them, or both of them, have got to pick up the telephone to a divorce lawyer and formalize what they know is the real case. So on June the 23rd is the opportunity to pick up that telephone to the divorce lawyer and let's get out. Thank you very much.